Yes. All right. So again, this is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to the Robust Opposition. Tonight, my guest is Steve Horn, who is the climate reporter for the Real News Network. And Steve has been on my show before. Welcome back to the Robust Opposition, Steve.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me. Good to be back.
Great. Well, it's a very hot day here in Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, and I don't have air conditioning going in this room, so I'm going to be drinking a lot of water. I don't know how it is for you. You're in San Diego, right? What's the temperature there today?
Probably like high 70s.
Oh gosh,
it's pretty mild.
It's nice.
Yeah.
High 80s here today, 90s. Okay, yeah. So let's get right into it. Let's start with your work on Joe Biden's climate plan, where it came from. So I want to start by reading a headline in today's New York Times, which says it all. Oil and gas groups see, quote, some common ground, end quote, in Biden energy plan. Now, according to your research, that's because they had a hand in writing it. Please explain.
Well, yeah, so to understand the Biden plan, you have to understand the people who are working for Biden. And that goes into two particular people, and I'll name the one that's more important for this, but I'll name them both. So one of them is Heather Ziegel, who was both of them are Obama alums, which may be not surprising given that Biden is Obama alum, but Heather Ziegel, she was Obama's top climate aide, known as his climate czar. And she left. She became a board of directors member of Cheniere, which is a natural gas exports company. And she was doing that up until becoming his top climate aide. And she's important for this, but not the most important person. The most important person, I think, to understand pretty much, I don't know, I'll put it equal. I don't know if she's more or less, but of equal playing field here is Ernest Moniz, who is a little bit more of an informal advisor for the campaign. So Heather Ziegel is formal enough that she left her board position. I think she earned over $1 million during her time at Cheniere, just serving on the board. But the person who is more informal and still serving on a board of a different fossil fuel company is Ernest Moniz, the former Secretary of Energy, who is currently still on the board of directors of Southern Company, which is a huge natural gas utilities company down in the Southeast United States and Southern U.S., I guess more the Southern U.S., like deep South. And they are a company that's probably the most well-known for trying to push CCS, or carbon capture and storage, which we'll talk about more later, I'm sure. But he, for that position, in his couple of years doing that, he's earned over $500,000. And he's known as sort of an evangelist of the CCS stuff. We'll talk more about what that means and the implications of it. But that's sort of how, if you look at the Biden plan, never says we support all of the above. It never says we support oil. It never says we support fracking. The key words in there, and I'm paraphrasing but also quoting, the quote is, he says, I'm going to quote unquote double down. And then he refers to carbon capture and sequestration. What that actually means, and again, we'll talk about more later, is he is going to be pumping money, subsidies, tax benefits, for the oil industry to do this. It ends up being a type of oil drilling, which we can talk about more. Basically, that's the key words in there. You have to look hard to find it, but that's in there. It never says we're going to do it for oil, but it kind of means that, which we can talk about. But that's why the oil industry is elated. That's why the oil industry came out after kind of all these plans, kind of looking at the collection of them, everything but before the Biden plan, the API came out, the American Petroleum Institute. They also expressed excitement over this. So I think that when you see the New York Times article, when you see the American Petroleum Institute coming out in press releases saying that they're excited about the plans that the Democrats are putting out, it raises questions about what they're pushing. And what they're pushing is this CCS, or this carbon capture and sequestration. Plus, I'll say, what's omitted in there. They never say we're going to crack down on fracking. They never say we're going to crack down on other kinds of drilling. So it's also what's not in there that's relevant.
Yes. Now, so there's another quote in that article and I'm reading it here, there is a lot of room in there for oil and gas, said Matt Gallagher, president of Parsley Energy, a West Texas oil producer, about the Biden plan. Some executives were particularly enthusiastic that Mr. Biden wanted the federal government to invest in carbon capture and sequestration, which you're going to explain, which entails preventing emissions of greenhouse gases from reaching the atmosphere and thus allowing industry to continue burning fossil fuels for decades. In a sign of his all-inclusive, eclectic, I love this, eclectic approach to energy, Mr. Biden is also proposing to use advanced nuclear reactors, and we remember this from Ernest Moniz, who, when he was Obama's Secretary of Energy, Obama was the first one to license any new nuclear plants in 30 years, but they were supposed to be the safe kind, the smaller kind, as if making them smaller makes them any safer or does anything about the nuclear waste problem. Mr. Biden is also proposing to use advanced nuclear reactors to produce electricity. So let's talk about these techniques, carbon sequestration, carbon capture, and also, you mentioned to me today, you sent me a message that the DNC came out against subsidizing fossil fuels because this is something that Bernie Sanders made a lot of hay over. Like, why are we subsidizing the richest industry on the planet? So they came out and said they're not going to do it, but you said that the platform belies that. So let's talk about that.
The platform belies it. We'll start with that because CCS or CCUS, and just to be clear, CCS is carbon capture and sequestration. CCUS is carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration or storage. And I think the U in that is important. We'll talk about what that utilization is. But that inherently exists because of a subsidy. It's a subsidy called the 45Q. It is part of it's an IRS code that was carved out to push forward this kind of mechanism, the CCS, and the various things that fall. And there's a lot of things that fall under CCS. One of them that is the most relevant to our discussion, because it's the most predominant thing that happens under it, is called enhanced oil recovery. What you do is, and the first big one of this got started on the Obama administration, so it's pretty relevant here. So enhanced oil recovery exists after the CCS. You capture the carbon at a place, and we'll use the actual tangible example that existed under Obama. It was a facility owned by Valero in Port Arthur, Texas, which is a major refining hub. They would capture that carbon. They would pump it westward to the Permian Basin, which is relevant to that guy that was quoted from Parsley Energy because they're a major producer in the Permian Basin. So of course he's excited. And they would pump the carbon westward. The carbon would then be pumped into the ground in the Permian Basin as a way as sort of like a second time of going down to drill, or the third time. After you've done your initial drilling attempt, you use carbon dioxide to access the oil that can't be obtained from before. So that's why I found the words double down to be almost accidentally like honest in a couple ways, but yeah, that they were actually saying we're gonna, keep drilling, but actually it literally means we're gonna double down and use this enhanced oil recovery technique to get the oil. So that is, and when I say that, there's a Congressional Research Service article, a report that came out in 2018 that says that EOR is something like 75+% of the CCUS right now in the United States is EOR. So it is, the 45Q is what subsidizes it. What it means is you are subsidizing oil drilling, and you're subsidizing the entire life cycle of it if you're thinking about it as a technique from the refinery through the pipeline, because these are called carbon dioxide pipelines. So CO2 pipelines all the way to pumping it in the ground. It's a subsidy for the entire life cycle of drilling. And I almost see it as as the next phase of the fracking revolution. It might not be fracking, but it's still another way that you're injecting this stuff under the ground and potentially creating your own set of risks, which we can talk about. But this is we're seeing a new era of this in the United States that has broad uptake within the Democratic Party right now, and labor.
You wrote in your article how this is going to be used for plastics, which is a new burgeoning industry and a new use for petroleum. And I did a show with, as you remember, Justin McCullough and Sharon Kelly about fracking for plastics probably like 2 years ago. So we can't get into the weeds too much because we've got a lot to cover, but let's go. This obviously Biden's plan is very, disappointing for climate activists. Let's compare that to the DNC platform, Climate Plank, which was just released either today or yesterday, which is also disappointing. And also, let's compare that to the Biden-Sanders Climate Task Force, which I had no hope for, seeing as it was going to be stacked with Biden appointees, and Varshini Prakash, who we'll talk about a little bit later, representing Bernie. And then let's compare that to the committee headed by Michelle Dietrich that came out of Pelosi's Green New Deal committee, the one that she famously did not let AOC be on, even though it was AOC's idea. So why don't you give us the similarities and the differences, the pros and cons between these plans?
Well, I'll talk about because you could probably say that the more towards I don't want to call it the gold standard, but I'll just for sake of metaphorical reference, we'll call it the gold standard among these, would be the DNC Climate Committee one, as you mentioned, the one that Michelle Dietrich is the chair of. And just to clarify, that was created because the DNC refused to hold a climate debate. So that was their concession. The other part, which is the select committee, who also has a report, that was created because AOC and the Sunrise Movement tried to create this select committee on the Green New Deal. Instead, Pelosi created the select committee on the climate crisis, which produced its own report. It was the first one among 4 that was published in July. And probably, I'll start with Dietrich's one. It's the most ambitious or the DNC Climate Committee one, it's the most ambitious because it says, it doesn't use the net zero. That's the biggest critique. They keep using this language for all the other ones of net zero by 2050. Those Californians who are watching will be familiar with that. We say net zero by 2045. What that means is it invites in, and that's the critique that Dietrich put out in the press release, is that opens up the door for all kinds of schemes like cap and trade or geoengineering or other ways in which you say that one thing cancels out another, therefore it's quote unquote net zero. Instead, she uses the term near zero and by 2040 plus deadlines along the way. So it's the way that all these other plans are written is that it's just by 2050. It could be, okay, we're going to procrastinate until 2049 and then try some Hail Mary geoengineering tool to bring it down to quote unquote net zero. The DNC Climate Committee one actually has deadlines along the way that are more in line with what the IPCC, International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is recommending, which is you can't just, the way that climate science works, you can't just put it off. Like when you talk about long-term deadlines, there are intermediate deadlines along that way. So that's what the DNC Climate Committee one takes into account. In terms of the details, like some of the things that stand out, I would say the Biden-Sanders one is probably the shortest in terms of the details. I think it's probably only maybe 2 or 3 pages. I could be wrong, but basically that one I was surprised to see, like, probably of the 4 things is actually probably the least progressive of the 4, which you would think, okay, it's called the Biden-Sanders one. That's how the the Sanders camp is going to get all kinds of progressive stuff in there. There's nothing in there that takes on the oil industry either. And in there, right again, they're still promoting carbon capture and sequestration. They're still promoting geoengineering through direct air capture, and that's the main one. So direct air capture is in all those. That is where you vacuum in carbon dioxide as ambient air. It's a technology that's becoming popular to promote within the same camp with the same type of subsidies as carbon capture and sequestration. And yeah, I think that if you want the most detailed look of all of them, it's the select committee, which is over 500 pages. And there's actually some decent stuff in there, not really as it applies to taking on the fossil fuel industry, but more along the lines of, like, for example, there's I forgot the name of the bill, but it's transit-oriented development bill that was introduced by Scott Peters, who's the representative here in San Diego. As Andrea, if she's on, she might hear this, but there are critiques about that could lead to gentrification. And honestly, it probably would without a lot of proper safeguards around affordable housing. But if you read that report, they actually do tackle the issue of affordable housing, and they don't just say development for development's sake. So I think that it would be important to see how it's implemented. But that was really important, I think, because there was a report that came out, or a study that came out last week that says that actually housing in the United States and the fuel for housing is causing 20% of all emissions in the United States. And if the United States were a country, just its homes, like heating its homes would be number 6 biggest country in the world for emissions. So I think that the idea of transit-oriented development and tackling sprawl is important. So I thought that was, I think that and maybe the Biden plan were the only ones that really grappled with the issue of housing. So there's interesting stuff in all of it, but the common theme among all 4 is that the fossil fuel industry is not being, not directly being taken on. There are ways around it that it could be, but yeah, in terms of, like I said, the key terms in the Biden plan that everyone needs to know are double down, because that's what's happening. That's reflected in that New York Times article.
Right. Now, clearly the DNC platform plank is not even as progressive as the one in 2016. Do you remember, and can you give us some highlights of that, of the climate plank of that platform? And let us know whether any of it came to pass, because as you know, Bernie Sanders touted the 2016 platform, and now he's touting the 2020 platform as the most progressive platform any Democratic Party has ever put forth. But you and I have always shared in the agreement that a platform is not even adhered to. It's not even worth the piece of paper that it's written on. So did Pelosi actually allow any good climate legislation to pass her House in the 2 years since she's been in control?
Pelosi and the Democrats would probably say, I'll start with that one. I will say they did pass one thing in a second. I'll get to that, which was pretty insignificant, I would say, in the big scheme of things. But they would say that the select committee was their crown jewel achievement, and that they had all these hearings and put out this big 500-page plus document, which talks about all these bills that were introduced. Like I said, the Peters one that didn't go anywhere, and a whole mountain of bills that are, I guess they consider these in Congress speak, like messaging bills, or there's another, marker bills. You lay down your markers to come back to it later. So they would say that's what we achieved. In terms of the comparison of 2016 though. So, and I'll go back to, Pelosi, the bill, their crown jewel achievement, according to Pelosi and the select committee, is probably that they passed the we're going back to Paris bill. We're going to re-enter into the Paris Climate Agreement. That's the thing that they passed. And of course, the Paris Climate Agreement is a flawed agreement to begin with, seen as unambitious, seen as not meeting the moment of what the climate crisis and what the climate science demands. So that would be the one that they held up pretty early on, that they rallied around. And I think they literally had like a public rally about signing and stuff outside of the Capitol. That's the main one. In terms of 2016, it ends up being that there's a lot of parallels, but I'll say one. So you had mentioned earlier on there was some concessions around the subsidies, which we talked about as kind of bunk. If you CCUS is part of it, it's kind of bunk. But they also talked about within the new 2021 compared to 2016, which is the same, as they say they're going to stop drilling on public lands and public waters. That very much remains to be seen. But that was a commonality, which I thought was different, but at the last minute it got inserted in yesterday. In the draft, it wasn't in there, but then yesterday, Michelle's group, the DNC climate group, got that in there. And the big difference, I think, is the Halliburton loophole. That was definitely in the 2016 one, closing that loophole. That was obviously something that progressives thought was not enough from Hillary Clinton. They were saying, well, that's all you're going to do with fracking is close the loophole. We need to... Even she said, I'll say, I think it was in 2016, it was, we're going to let local communities have a say in fracking. So if the local community doesn't want it, that's what she said in 2016. Yeah. None of that is in there in 2020. There's nothing about local communities. There's nothing about the Halliburton loophole. So we're now at the 15th anniversary of the Halliburton loophole in a couple of weeks when that bill passed. And there's nothing in there in the 2020 DNC.
Can you please explain to the viewers what the Halliburton loophole is?
Yeah, the Halliburton loophole, without the Halliburton loophole, there is no fracking because it would just be completely uneconomical. Basically, it's a piece of language that was, or provision, you could say, that was inserted into the 2005 Energy Policy Act, which basically exempts the industry from EPA enforcement of the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act as it applies to the horizontal drilling method known as fracking. So if the industry contaminates water, those bills, those legacy pieces of legislation don't apply to the oil and gas industry. It's something they had lobbied for about a decade. And they had openly said in the decade leading up to, we can't do fracking unless we have this loophole. So under the Bush administration, they had gotten that passed. Now, I was actually kind of interested to see how did Biden vote on that, and back in 2016, how did Clinton vote on that? They actually both voted no, so that's kind of interesting. But yeah, unlike Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden and the group of people that are now working with him on the DNC didn't even get that inserted into the 2020.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned local communities deciding, because I don't know if my viewers know, but I was a delegate to the 2016 convention. I was a Sanders delegate. And today is the 4th anniversary of the TPP protest that I organized that was on the floor of the convention. And I look back wistfully because there isn't going to be any delegates on the floor of the convention to protest. And the most thing we have going on is that the delegates, about 600 of them, have signed a pledge saying they won't vote for the platform because it doesn't have Medicare for all on it. But they're just saying that this doesn't mean that they're not going to vote for Biden. So the Sanders delegates, and Sanders himself has been totally defanged. But at that convention, Tom Steyer had a hospitality suite for all the California delegation. And the first night, I guess it was 4 years ago today, I did meet him in that, and I knew that he was thinking of running for governor at that time. And I asked him, I said, I've been fighting fracking since 2012, and I don't think you can really run for governor in this state unless you're in favor of banning fracking. And last I heard, you were not in favor of banning fracking. And he looked at me in such a way that made me feel like I was the most important person in the room. And he said, I really want to talk to you about this. He said, because I've been thinking that maybe what we should do is leave it up to the local communities. So if they want to have fracking, they can have it. And if they want to ban fracking, they can ban it. And I said, well, no, because I think fracking is kind of like secondary smoke. Just because somebody wants to smoke doesn't mean that the person who is receiving who's in the vicinity of the smoker isn't going to come down with cancer as a result of that. Same thing with fracking. And he said, I find that a very interesting position. I will consider it. So that's Tom Steyer. And what you're saying is even his position, well, what did you say? So I'm getting confused with all the plans. Is that the accepted wisdom or the accepted position of the DNC right now? Yeah.
The accepted position of DNC is there's no language about fracking, so I guess de facto it's okay. I mean, the language is about public lands and public waters and subsidies. Of course, we already said the subsidies one is kind of thrown out the window if you support CCUS. So yeah, fracking is fair game. The Halliburton loophole is fair game, I guess, according to the DNC for 2020. So they've moved backwards on that since 2016.
And of course, they also supported John Hickenlooper, who we call Governor Frackenlooper, who threatened to sue 5 Colorado towns for banning fracking over the environmentalist supporter of the Green New Deal, Andrew Romanoff, including Elizabeth Warren endorsed Hickenlooper, I want to say. So I want to read you this part of this New York Times article, which quotes a supposedly liberal Democratic consultant who's been around forever. He's probably in his late 70s by now. Quote, that oil and gas interests are okay with a potential Biden presidency might scare some liberals, said Robert Shrum, the director of the University of Southern California Center for the Political Future, who has advised Al Gore, John Kerry, and other Democrats, quote, there would be some people in the Democratic Party who would get upset that there are oil people who are supporting Biden, but they ought to back off. Don't we want to win Texas? So to that, I would reply, yes, because winning Texas in the short run is so much more important than saving humanity in the long run. So I want to ask you, Steve, is this attitude about winning driving Biden and the Democrats, or is it more that they get donations from these industries, or is it a combination of the two?
Great question. I just want to start with who is Bob Schrum, just really quick. So I think anyone who's watching should see the documentary Our Brand is Crisis. It's directed by Rachel Boynton. It shows that people like him and James Carville, how they use this kind of message, not this message, but just messaging to the message of crisis, I guess, in Bolivia back in 2005, after they were alums of the Bill Clinton age. But basically how they completely screwed over Bolivia, got a World Bank allied guy by the name of Goni elected within a year due to popular protest in the streets in Bolivia. Goni was basically forced out of office, and that gave rise to, I forgot the name of Bolivia's leader, but the famous leftist leader in Bolivia. So the precursor to that is the polling work that Schrum was doing in Bolivia with his colleagues, Jeremy Greenberg, Carville, et cetera. And to answer your question, though, I think this gets back to who is around the Biden team. And Moniz is key here. So Moniz has spearheaded, on Earth Day, 50th anniversary, spearheaded something called the Labor Energy Partnership, which is a partnership between, it would be de facto the oil industry, then it would be labor, and it would be bigger environmental groups, including his own. I forgot the name of it. He has a think tank that spearheaded it. And this is an alliance to push all of the above energy strategy, including and geoengineering, so direct air capture, carbon capture and sequestration, basically a continuation of oil and gas drilling. And it is not only that, but there's another coalition that is run by an organization called the Center for Climate and Energy Strategy, or C2ES, which has a parallel coalition with labor. So I think that there's a parallel to California that's happening right now that we saw kind of happen last year when there was activism around AB 345 and setbacks of oil wells, in which, in reaction to that, I would call it a formidable political alliance was created called the Common Ground Alliance. And it's very much the same thing. It's an alliance between oil and labor, not so much environmental groups. But yeah, I think it shows, I think we're seeing a new trend of, it was actually started by environmental groups, actually, the Blue-Green Alliance we saw. But now it's becoming where that was between labor and environmental groups. I think they learned from that, and now the industry is allying with unions directly to push political causes. And I think that you cannot understand what's happening with Biden without understanding both Moniz and the thing he created, which is the Labor Energy Partnership. So that's kind of fundamental to it all.
Well, you might remember that in 2013, I think that was the same year you invited me onto the fracking panel at the Left Forum. We organized and we're going to talk about California in a little bit, but we organized a protest of the Blue-Green Alliance because they were giving the Right Stuff Award to Jerry Brown. And it was one of my more creative protests, because what we actually did was we made a program, and if you open up the program, you could see why, all the bullet points, why he should be getting the Wrong Stuff Award. But we had people handing it out as people were entering the hall, and I wasn't even there. I was flying somewhere and sort of doing this thing remotely with my comrades in San Francisco. But Jerry Brown got wind of the fact that we would be out there protesting him, and he didn't even show up to get his award. But I was so disgusted because that same year, Maria Elena Durazo, who was head of the LA County Fed at the time, bussed in 500 workers to Carson to speak against the fracking moratorium bill there that the mayor Robles had supported. And now, of course, fast forward to this year, we see the IBEW, the Electrical Workers Union, protesting outside of Garcetti's house when he canceled the investment into the 3 aging gas plants that we worked so hard to get with a coalition of groups, and also his Green New Deal. So
that's the same. Yeah, IBEW is the same one. So they're part of the Labor Energy Partnership. And actually, I'm glad you brought up the Green New Deal. Part of it was Moniz's reaction to the Green New Deal was, before the Labor Energy Partnership got off the ground, he created something called the Green Real Deal. So he's not only kind of creating this edifice now with the Biden camp, but yeah, he's been front and center in fighting back against the Green New Deal. I mean, you don't even need the Republican Party to do it, because you have people like Ernest Moniz right in there in the fold when that thing came out. And within months, he wrote a policy memo called the Green Real Deal, which is, of course, all the above. It's everything we're talking about, CCUS. And that's that. If you look at the Green Real Deal, it's probably very similar to the things that you kind of see it as a preview of what might be coming out of a Biden administration.
Yeah. So we got to talk about the opposition, because we remember that this Green New Deal came upon the scene. Well, first of all, it came upon the scene with Howie Hawkins' campaign for governor of New York back in, I guess, 2009 or something like that. And then
2010.
2010, and then Jill Stein picked it up in 2012. So when AOC used it, it really wasn't new. And that came on the heels of, Margaret Salomon Klein's The Climate Mobilization, which was very similar language, talking about a World War II style mobilization against climate change. But, of course, AOC is a rock
Before
star.
that, Naomi Klein, right, in her book.
In the LEAP manifesto, you mean?
Yeah, I think she talked about the World War II mobilization and This Changes Everything as well.
Right. I love that book. We'll be talking about that book in a little bit. But yeah, so we have the, Sunrise Movement, which is the youth movement coming on to protest outside of Nancy Pelosi's office, with AOC showing up in support and having such high hopes for them. I had her on my show, Varshini Prakash. She's the co-founder of that group, about 2 years ago. And I have to say that it gave me pause when I asked her if she would use the tactics, the radical tactics employed by the tar sands blockade people when they actually chained their bodies to the bulldozers when they were trying to lay the pipeline for the Keystone XL South. And she said, no, we're not going to use those tactics. So as you know, Steve, since I've been a member of Californians Against Fracking, all I do is say we should be chaining ourselves to the fracking rigs. These protests are performative. They don't accomplish anything. They just give activists an opportunity to speak for 2 hours. People walk around marching, chanting, holding signs, posting it on Facebook, and nothing ever changes. So we really need to do, put our bodies like Mario Savio, stop the machine. And so I'm all for that. And I'm thinking this young person who's like 40 years younger than me is going to go for this technique. And no, she doesn't want to have anything to do with it. So then I've watched her organization take money from all the usual liberal foundations, run by millionaires. And I've watched her public profile increase to the point where, in this article she just wrote with John Podesta, which I'll get to in a second, she literally calls herself the the point person for Bernie Sanders. I don't know why didn't ever hear her get that title, but she's elevated herself. So it appears to me that her personal career advancement and wanting to get a seat at the table, we always talk about that, how access is so important, and giving access tends to co-opt these people, seems to be more important than her original goal when she got into this as a University of Massachusetts Amherst student, spearheading the divestment movement to stop catastrophic climate change. So now she writes, first of all, she's putting lipstick on this pig of this task force, which is horrible, as we talked about. And now she's writing an article in The Nation with John Podesta, which if people don't remember, he was Clinton's campaign chairman, And she writes in here, new polling from Climate Power 2020 finds 71% favor bold government action on climate change, while only 18% oppose it. And talking about climate moves votes for Democrats. When presented as a choice between a Democratic congressional candidate in favor of bold climate action, the vote moves, and anti-action Republican, the vote moves 14 points in the Democrats' favor. This jump is even bigger, 21 points for centrist Republican and Democratic voters. These numbers are astronomical, and they make clear that running aggressively on climate is the Democratic Party's biggest political opportunity this election. This is fucking laughable. Excuse my French. Aggressive, bold, you know, I mean, what is this? They're gaslighting us. They think that we're going to look at these plans and think these are bold and aggressive, and this is what she's trying to sell people?
Well, the thing about it, though, yeah, we'll start with that one. So it's like, you can campaign. It goes back to the same thing. What is even a platform? What is a campaign? You know, you can campaign. Obama campaigned on some pretty awesome things in 2008 also, including ending the tyranny of oil, right? I think that's the one that people would always point back to. And of course, fracking expanded so vastly under his watch that by the time he was done as president, he got in front of business leaders as a White House alum, and he says, you know, I built enough pipelines to wrap around the world 5 times. People say I was not friendly to the industry. Well, I was really friendly to the industry. I mean, he's honest about it, right? He's honest that he was an ally to the industry, and that's what happens. I think that it goes to, it kind of reminds me of the Stayers. You talked about Tom Steyer just a little bit before. Tom Steyer's organization, the entire theory of it to begin with, he had a think tank, but he also, his electoral stuff was all about running on climate. The next gen climate action was, that's gonna be our main message. We're gonna get climate candidates, and you don't get too lost in the details of what the policy is. You just say, we need strong climate action. And it just becomes like, it becomes a talking point. It doesn't even become like a real thing that you can hold candidates accountable. I will say that they are one step ahead of next gen in that they do run, you know, and endorse incumbents to the establishment sometimes. So they're not quite at that level, but still, you can definitely see, to your original point, that someone like her and the way that they position themselves, they are straddling both lines between the establishment on one hand and the progressive part of the movement on the other hand. And they're in complicated territory because the Green New Deal in of itself is a thing that is a partnership with, in their minds, hopefully, with some of the very same unions that are pushing some of this bad stuff that we've been talking about, the CCUS, fighting back against setbacks, fighting for more fracking. And groups privately have told me that they've seen that as kind of problematic because of, they got into this whole Green New Deal thing without understanding, or maybe not caring, maybe not listening about the political dynamics of that. And so that's sort of the territory they're in. And the last thing I'll say, very symbolically, because we had talked about the Blue-Green Alliance, and that's a Sierra Club thing. Well, Sunrise shares an office in DC, at least they did before. You know, that was like their starting place. They might have more funding now, so they don't have to. But in DC, they originally shared an office with the Sierra Club. And I think that's kind of symbolic for all kinds of interesting reasons. But of course, the Sierra Club is kind of one of those organizations that straddles the line between mostly big green, but also in some ways, you know, they seem a little more progressive than like NRDC or EDF. And so they kind of toe both lines and straddle both spheres. That is sort of the same territory that we're talking about right now with Sunrise. And I'll say I was pretty frustrated because I'm working on some reporting on all of this, and they wouldn't talk to me. They wouldn't give me any quote. They wouldn't give me even like a curated quote. They just wouldn't respond to, what do you think about geoengineering? What do you think about CCUS? What do you think about these things that are in these documents? Just nothing. And you haven't seen really any vocal stuff from them about those particular prongs. You maybe see them saying, oh, we can fight for something to be better, it could have been better, but here's the great things we got. You don't see them really slamming the bad things. And to me, that's kind of noteworthy. It shows that they want to, at least, you know, they like some of the access they have. I think they've probably been lured in a little bit by some of these powerful figures that have embraced them. But I've joked about this with you on social media. If you're quote unquote, if you're at the table, then you're on the menu. I think that in some ways you can see that happening a little bit with them as they've kind of gotten more of a platform in big media outlets and social media.
Well, we don't have time to get into this anymore. I just really hope that the people in the local Sunrise hubs follow what their leadership is doing, because they make a very big show of, getting input from their local chapters. And I know their local Los Angeles chapter is doing some very good work, although I will say the last several newsletters I've seen from them have pivoted. They've completely pivoted to posting about Black Lives Matter stuff. I would say they'll post about 4 Black Lives Matter stuff, and almost as an afterthought, they'll post something about, the environment or climate change. Now, let's go through the rest of our agenda really quickly, because poor Andrea Grossman, who's going to talk about this horrible desalinization plant in California that is very near to completion, has been waiting patiently to come on. But I do want to speak real briefly about the rest of the subjects that we're going to talk about, and one of which was pipelines. So you recently wrote an article about these decisions that have that environmental groups have hailed as being very positive, stopping pipelines, and yet you're not very sanguine about them. Talk about these decisions and some of the deep dives that you did into them to explain to people why you feel the way you do.
So I would say that I guess I don't hold like the same triumphant stance as some, but I will say that I try not to be dismissive of what happened. So what happened with Dakota Access Pipeline was absolutely a monumental decision. The fact that they got a judge to say that the pipeline should be taken out of the ground and oil removed is completely legally unprecedented. And that is the result of years of grassroots struggle, led, of course, by indigenous people, first and foremost, and not only because it was multiple tribes, but first and foremost, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. And that was huge. That was big, but then a week later, you saw the appeals court say, and I think they were the most sober about it. They said, this is huge, but we are cautiously optimistic. And a week later, the appeals court said, the oil can keep flowing through the pipeline as these things proceed. So the biggest part of that, which would have been the oil not flowing through the pipeline, is now gone. So now it's kind of a legal procedural thing. Maybe the appeals court will uphold that, but maybe it'll just say you need to do a new environmental review to check those boxes and the thing remains in business. That's very possible. And that gets into the other big one that national audience will be interested in. There's the third one is the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, but I think Keystone XL is the one the national audience will probably be more aware of. That one was also a really big deal, but I'm guarded about why it's a big deal. I think that it could be a big deal. It was originally a really big deal that the district court judge said that the nationwide Permit 12 process, which is in short a fast track mechanism to build pipelines across waterways that was being used in unprecedented ways during the Obama administration, has carried on during the Trump administration to build thousands upon thousands of miles of pipelines. The judge said that entire mechanism should be thrown out. That was also humongous. It was like, wow, this fast track mechanism is gone. The oil industry was freaking out. You see them weighing in the case. You see them weighing in press releases. And then they brought it up in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court rules nationwide Permit 12 is now back in play, except for on Keystone XL, where you need to go through a regular environmental review process. So the biggest part of it was cost, which is that the entire industry cannot use this mechanism. So the fast track mechanism is still there. And I just want to show how important is this fast track mechanism. Just to kind of take this conversation full circle, right now the Defense Authorization Act is being debated in Congress and what will be in there. And as all budgets go, there are provisions in there that have nothing to do with the subject of the budget. The Defense Authorization Act has a provision in there to promote carbon capture and sequestration technology and to fast track what we talked about earlier, which is carbon dioxide pipelines, through the same mechanism, the same program that all of these other pipelines have been fast-tracked, which is through something called the Federal Permitting Steering Council, something that was created during Obama, carried into the Trump era. And those pipelines can now fall under that program if it passes in the House. It passed in the Senate version of the defense authorization bill. So if it goes through the House, Trump signs it, it's a whole nother genre of pipelines that can be fast-tracked, which would probably end up being both through that Federal Permitting Steering Council and the Nationwide Permit 12 program. So it's really, I think, whatever the final outcome is, to bring this to the end of the answer, whatever the outcome of the Keystone XL case is, what the judge says, and now it's in the appeals court, what the judges say, that's kind of like the future of the Nationwide Permit 12 program is really important for the future of pipelines. Because the industry has said outright that if they have to go through the normal permitting process, basically engage in democracy, they're going to lose a lot of money and it will hold up a lot of projects. So that's why they want this program to exist. That's why it was so important that it still exists, because of the Supreme Court. And it's, I think, how narrow or how broad the appeals court decision applies will be pretty instrumental for the future of pipelines in the United States, for not for CO2 pipelines, maybe, but at least for oil and gas pipelines.
I'm gonna stop the recording here because I want to do, it's already over 45 minutes, and I'm just gonna do another recording with the California stuff. And because I don't have the ability to edit where I am, I'm gonna stop this recording right now, and then I will come back. So don't go away.